Thanks, Janine, and thank you for being part of that biodiversity team, and you and Anna coming to those meetings. It wouldn't work without participation. So what I'm going to do is try to get us started on the second of the 4 topics in this RCN. This is the one on biodiversity detection and monitoring. I'm a NASA guy, so I'm going to take a NASA sort of top-down approach, talk a lot about satellite stuff, which I think is relevant, but there's and scale is a big part of this whole RCN and a big part of what we're going to be working on. It's something I'll get into in a minute that I've had to obsess about for a long time. But there's another sort of sub-theme that I think is really going to be critical for us to address and maybe can help structure some of what we do over this week, and that is integration. Craig, in closing his talk yesterday, mentioned the need to, in bold, to do a better job of integrating across approaches to understand refugia, for example. I think we've sort of got 4 themes across the first 4 days of the workshop. I think there's a need for integration within each of those themes. And then I'm going to argue that when you somehow come back, and this is the way you guys have set this up is really well. I love the themes, by the way. The topics are great. And then we're going to cross-integrate across those integrated sub-themes. And so that's sort of the goal. And I'm going to focus on, maybe how we can do that, looking at some workflows and approaches to that. The first, scale. So scale is really the overarching issue that I think we have to deal with. This picture from the Venus satellite of the Earth represents both a problem and an opportunity. First, the problem. We started doing biodiversity at NASA as its own sort of thing about in 1998. That's been 20 years. So I just looked back, it just sort of blew my mind. It's 20 years we've been working on this, trying to use satellite data to understand life on Earth and how it's changing. And when that started, it almost didn't get started because the issue was obviously, you can't see the vast majority of biodiversity or its elements in this type of imagery. And so I was forever sort of trying to make the case that it's important for context and the context for what we're seeing, and although we can't actually see species necessarily, with a few exceptions, it's still relevant. And so it was almost over before it got started. I think that sort of near-death experience early in my career helped sort of set me up for being scale-obsessed from that point onward. The opportunity in this is that it is the big picture. It is the context. And so I started thinking about satellite imagery, whether it's this coarser scale data, it's probably a couple hundred meters data, even Landsat data, which we have globally now, which is amazing. Global Landsat data, 30 meters, free and openly available. That's just been around the last 6, 7, 8 years or so. But these Landsat and MODIS and Sentinel and other satellite data sets really provide almost like a tree. I think it's sort of like a Christmas tree on which we can hang all these finer scale data sets, but it provides the sort of a backdrop and framework upon which we can put the other information we have and help organize it and put it at least into a spatial and hopefully temporal as well context. And so I'm going to argue that the imagery, it's actually doing more and more these days. We're in a time when, and I'm going to touch on this too, frankly, satellite data, as you guys know, is getting higher spatial resolution. We've got commercial companies that are making, 4 meter, even 1 meter data available. Planet Now, we'll talk more about that, is making the Earth available every day. So you're getting down to scales now where you can actually, pick out individual tree canopies. You can see large megafauna on the savannas of Africa. You can actually start seeing stuff in imagery which you couldn't do back in '98 when we started this. So that's really cool. And we're also living in a time when there is just an explosion of new, what I'll characterize as in situ observation approaches that are themselves being networked. We'll talk more about that. Camera trap networks, acoustic networks, molecular eDNA networks, animal movement data, movement networks, citizen science networks, you guys know all of this, but I mean, it's just an incredibly exciting, rich time. And so the data, they're not all there, but a lot is there. And so our challenge, and I think the challenge for this RCN going forward, is to think about how we can best integrate these different data sets And there are multiple ramifications of that, as I'm going to talk in my next, well, almost the next one. So first of all, just back to my NASA roots a bit. This is how we historically have thought about scale. These are 4 terrestrial ecology projects started by Diane Wicklund, who was sort of my mentor at NASA. She was the program manager for terrestrial ecology for a number of years, retired a couple of years ago. Back 30 years ago now, 1987, 88, 89, she did FIFE, which was the first ISSLSCIP, a lot of acronyms. Sorry, ISSLSCIP is International Satellite Land Surface Climatology Project. First ISSLSCIP field experiment in Kansas, Kanza Prairie. And so Diane developed this framework where you're basically, going all the way from the leaf up to the very large areas, using towers to get fluxes, on-the-ground information, of course, airborne data, airborne remote sensing, and satellite remote sensing, and putting it all together in a framework to understand what was happening in that system. Now, the focus of this wasn't biodiversity. It was really to get at fluxes, primarily of carbon. They looked a little bit at nitrogen, but elemental fluxes into the system. The ultimate, one of these, probably the primary ultimate user was climate modeling, climate groups, biochemical modeling, to get into, do a better job of understanding their system, feeding into their system models with a real focus on climate. So this would be sort of, we're talking about essential biodiversity variables in a minute. This would be the essential climate variable feed in. And so that was sort of the focus of those key experiments. After FIFE, Diane did something called Boreas, boreal ecosystem atmosphere experiment in the Canadian boreal. That was back in, let's see, the mid-90s, late 90s, 2000. She did something called LBA, large biosphere atmosphere experiment in Amazonia. And then now, Hank Margolis has taken over from Diane, something called ABOVE, which is the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment. All of these really are characterized looking at those fluxes. As time has gone on, they've gotten much more into the diversity elements. Where I would say ABOVE, say finally, has really gotten, it's looking across not just the ecosystems as sources of carbon, nitrogen, whatever, to a broader system model, but really for its own sake, how those systems are changing. And so there's, some of you guys are funded under ABOVE, I'm sure, and so they're doing animal movement in ABOVE. They're doing other elements of what I would consider more biodiversity-related science. So it's only, but primarily this is sort of our focus, and that's not a bad structure. And it does force you to integrate across scales. It's very pixel-oriented. How can we tell what something like a handheld ASD spectrometer that I'm looking at a leaf? How do I scale that up to the canopy? How do I scale that up to the community, the system, and how do I go from that to something even sort of biome-wide, perhaps? So back to this workshop and 4 themes that you got, 4 topics that you guys have set up, which I think are really, really great. And the challenge that we have of, first of all, breaking these down, each of the 4, and then figuring out how to integrate across those individual topics, and then ultimately to bring it back together at the end where we're integrating across the topics. So yesterday we talked largely, it's basically the theoretical issues that we're challenged, that are incredibly important. Doing scale requires fundamental theoretical work. To the degree that I've been arguing, not very effectively, and I haven't put any money on it, which is my fault, but that we should have an annual scaling workshop. About 8 years ago, Diane did something in Fort Collins, I think, a scaling workshop with NSF, sort of leading into NEON. It was a one-off deal. We should be doing that every freaking year, because there's just so much there about, not just about the observational aspects, just the theory behind how life scales. We don't know enough there to do this. So we talked about, Craig led us into that yesterday. Today, the more observational aspects of it. And by observation, I'm not just talking about imagery, but also the models are, integral part of that. We can't do just the observations and models are really linked like this. And so I consider those as two parts of an observational paradigm. Models are typically how you do the integration across observation, also the framework for understanding what it is we're doing, and they bring the theory into the observations and instructive. tomorrow, bioinformatics and cyber infrastructure, Rob's going to talk about that. There's a huge data challenge here, just managing information. Some of that is sort of just how you build networks, and some of it is just statistical and understanding how information itself works, how to work within that context. And the volumes that we're going to be talking about here, as we go from Landsat data at 30 meters, which was a huge jump from MODIS or AVHR, I'm sorry to throw out all these the coarser resolution daily sensors, to something that were at hundreds of meters, down to something at tens of meters every other week. So just the volume, but now we're going into a world where we're doing, Landsat has what, 8, 9 channels, 8, 9 bands. We're going to spectrometers, hyperspectral systems that have a couple of hundred channels, 300, whatever channels or bands to deal with. And we're talking about doing that at that same 30-meter spatial scale for Landsat on the same temporal time frame about every other week. So just, the volumes of data are insane. Just dealing with the biodiversity data alone would be massive. The eBird information, stuff like that. So we have a big data problem there that we're going to tackle, and that also requires integration. And then Bill's going to talk on Thursday about science communication. I view that as there's not just reaching out to the public and having them understand what we do, but there's both a programmatic element to sort of how do we organize ourselves domestically, globally to do this job, and there's also there's a social aspect to it, where how does my discipline talk to this discipline, and how do we set up frameworks, networks to allow them to have those communications in a positive way. And then how do we tell the world about this so we actually get support to do it? Most of us live in more or less democratic societies, and so we're going to get funded either by governments, as this is largely a public good, or maybe we'll get foundation support, or maybe private sector can be brought in. There's an interesting article in Science just a couple of weeks ago, an editorial perspective team saying, looking at the Paris Accord, and can we do something similar to that for biodiversity, all in the context of Yo Wilson's Half Earth call. And then Eric Dinnerstein did his bioscience paper and said, well, what if we were to really do Half Earth, what's it going to cost us? And so now the number is, the number du jour is $100 billion a year, only $100 billion a year. And this paper, this perspective piece in Science was saying, we could do it as we did the Paris Climate Accords, which is largely governments, but would it be even better, smarter, if we allowed the private sector to invest in this too, which Paris really did, and thus brought in companies that had an interest in certain elements of nature in their maintenance. So just a clarion call to say we can actually possibly raise these kinds of dollars, but to do that, what Bill's going to talk about on Thursday is really, we have to have sort of a global consensus. This is a good thing, and not everybody's got to buy in, but enough people have to buy in to do significant fundraising to make it happen. So break each of these down. I'm going to suggest we should do workflows for each of these, and then bring those workflows together. The next thing. And so back a little bit on the sensing side. Yeah, we need to integrate all of this stuff, but this is back to topic 2. Satellites, which are getting more and more capable, both public sector, which are largely free and open, private sector, which you often have to pay for, but interestingly, private sector is going to give their data away if for certain understandings. So there's, Planet has you guys maybe get, some of you guys are probably getting Planet data for free. There you go. And so there are ways to do it for certain research purposes. So that's global. Satellites are really good for the big picture. Airborne stuff, UAVs, aircraft, old school, for more focused NEON-like efforts, which can be national. Then we've got all of this is sort of the in-situ level for the local scales up. Drones, citizen science, camera traps, acoustics, movement, eDNA. Each of these has its own, but Wildlife Insights, their team are trying to integrate these. You've got multiple groups like eBird doing this stuff, Blue Bank over here, eDNA networks starting to build at the micro level. So all these are starting to network themselves. The challenge is then how to bridge those networks. It's not the good thing is they're already self-organized. Maybe the bad thing is they're all doing it independently, but that's okay. That's a problem that's maybe good to have and least they're organized. So I've been, everywhere I've looked in the last couple of weeks getting ready for this talk, I keep seeing workflows pop up, so I just sort of got workflow on the mind. This is from Mike Dietz's new book. It's his first and his last figure in his book, Ecological Forecasting. And it's sort of the workflow for the book. Mike uses it to sort of say, here's how I'm going to do ecological forecasting in this framework, how I'm going to walk you through it. But it's also a really good way of just organizing your thoughts. Of course, you guys know workflows. Workflows are really important if you want to recreate something, keeping all the pieces, sort of make sure you can track what you did in terms of data management, go back and do it. That's retrospective, but it's also really helpful prospectively to sort of say, how am I going to do this? And when you got a big challenge, a big job like we have at this RCN, you sort of, what the heck? How do we? What are even the pieces? So you start out by defining your pieces and start connecting them in sort of a wiring diagram, just to sort of say, let's get our head around the totality of what it is we're trying to do, and then start connecting dots. Now, really, again, your 4 topics I think lend themselves to this sort of approach, and you could do one of these for each of the topics, and then do the Uber one across all of those. I think would be really, really effective. So, Mike, thanks for that. I'm going to do a couple examples from some papers or some work that's going on now. This is a new paper. Daniel Kisley and a bunch of folks are on. Rob's on this, and some other people. Donald Coburn and a lot of folks. All the others in this room, sorry. This is a GeoBond focused example. GeoBond is the group. It's an international consortium, Group on Earth Observations, Biodiversity Observation Network. It's a the Group on Earth Observations has over 100 countries getting together to basically coordinate observations. Satellite, in situ, airborne, in water, land, across the board. Generally the government level. And work with, and so they have something. So they have something called GeoBond to organize biodiversity observations, which is NASA's a supporter of, other agencies have been supporting. I think it's a great framework, more on that later, but they've divided their work in GeoBond into classes of observations, one of which Walter leads, is focused on species populations. And species populations, that particular class, is focused on 2 things, 2 elements of species distribution and abundance. Species distribution and population abundance are 2 subsets. So Kisley and all were trying to come up with a framework which ultimately got to workflow as to how you can organize the multiplicity of observations to do species, population, members, distribution, and abundance assessments. And so first of all, they got the data cube where you've got space along one axis, time along another, space being x, y, coordinates, time, whatever time metric you want to use, and then taxonomy on the third axis of the cube. It could be species, it could be functional types, it could be ecosystems themselves, whatever. You can fill these up. They then define it along the lines of extent. Is this global? Is it regional? Is it local? Resolution, which is really your grain size. How big's your pixel or whatever observation tool you're using. And then the measurement units, for again space, time, taxonomy. And then tracking uncertainties on the other side. So just say, okay, so this is the initial step, how to break things down. This is not meant to be like, do it this way. It's an example of how one group in this GeoBond partnership are trying to tackle the observational aspects of monitoring species distribution and abundance through time. So then what they do, they come up with 4 large sample data sets, right? Where they apply the space, time, and taxonomy breakouts to eBird data, global data set, team data, global tropical data, largely. So eBird, of course, is a science team, camera traps, other types of sensors, on-ground sensors. LPI, Liquid Height Index, which is an abundance data set of vertebrates globally. We'll got that going. And then a zone finding data set for the Baltics. And so we said, okay, let's take some real data, sort of run it through this framework, and see how it works. And again, breaking down extent, resolution. So you're defining what you're doing from the get-go, which again I think is really useful. There are plenty. We can do similar work with example data sets of our own. And then they get to a workflow where they play this out, and basically they sort of got three categories of data here. Each of them could stand alone, or you could feed one into the other. So you're starting here with basically figuring out what data are out there in this orange colors, identifying more raw data, check data sharing agreements, make sure you can use the data, check data, that's just basically defining the data set. Green here, then the next step, you start working with the data, clean the data, combine data, join data sets from different sources, try to do that integrate, additional integration, match up taxonomies, check data quality, check, synonyms, etc. Clean it up. And then when you've done that, then you're ready to if you want to model with it, do something to take to the next level, you can do that. Try to make sure it's fit for what you're using it for, identify the tool you're using now, do statistics with it, calculate certainty, and then visualize results, spits it all out. It's a way to sort of break down how you start working with multiplicity of data, how you can bring those together and integrate. And then you apply a single model to those integrated data sets or models. So here's a real world example. This is work that's been done under NASA funding by Jennifer Swinson and Jim Clark and your folks at Duke. It's actually a technology proposal. It's not, I put a little money in this, but it's really our Earth Science Technology Office folks at NASA. Mike Little, really great program manager, very visionary. Awful. So what they're doing, they've got a modeling framework called GJAM, Generalized Joint Attribute Modeling, which they're using to get at essentially how in a climate-changing climate, how biodiversity attributes are changing. They're bringing together sort of multiple types of data, some from satellites, some from other geospatial sources, soils data, spectroscopy data they're throwing in as well, which is really exciting. Here they're using LiDAR, sort of the spectroscopy LiDAR combination. And then they've got neon data. In this example, they're working with neon plants, beetles, things that neon takes. See things that neons collect. We're bringing those together, cleaning it up, working through GJAM, and then to address these model questions. So sort of that three ways. This is actually not for the colors don't match. So don't take the colors too literally. It's just showing what they're doing. For them, the colors mean how far they've gotten. They're in the second year of a 2-year grant. So this is where they are. They're doing this. So that's another workflow. That's with neon data. They're doing something similar with breeding bird survey data. Again, a big national data set. They're doing something with eBird data. The use of eBird and DBS is really interesting from a statistical perspective because it lets you sort of look at two very different approaches to collecting data. eBird, citizen science data, you map eBird data, it tends to be really clustered around where people are, suburban areas, vacation spots. They had North Carolina map, and it's like, there was Raleigh, there's, Charlotte, Greensboro, and then Eastern Shore where people go. There's tons of eBird for that, but there are big gaps in that. Whereas DBS, of course, while it's not as much data by any means, statistically, they're more randomized transects. And so you can statistically, they're trying to look at ways to use the DBS or randomized approach to form the richer eBird data set and vice versa to sort of play off the statistics of those two collections. They're also working with the Forest Service data set as well. So I'm going to switch gears now and talk a little bit about some near-term opportunities from a NASA perspective. This slide is just to say that we've got this really active couple of years coming up. These are instruments that are going up to the space station, and below them in their sort of Venn diagram circles or ellipses are the things that each of these systems do. The picostress is a thermal
Spectral thermal sensor that's going to space station at the end of June. Jedi is a LiDAR that's going to space station in November, a vegetation LiDAR. So it's mapping the near-infrared bounce back of vegetation. OCO3, Orbiting Carbon Observatory, it's looking at fluorescence. So a lot of, just getting back to the basics of photosynthesis and it's doing. And then Isui is a Japanese, again, these are all space station imaging spectrometers, so visible, near RR, infrared, hyperspectral sensor. Okay. There's also something called Thesis, which is a German DLR-built and Teledyne Brown U.S. company operated spectrometer that's going with these. So we've got visible shortwave infrared, thermal, active LiDAR, fluorescence data, all going to space stations within roughly a year or so of each other. So there'll be a lot of potential overlaps. So it's a really exciting time in terms of these global data sets, at least from 50 degree north to 50 degree south, that's what's covered by the station, to combine some very powerful tools in ways that we really haven't had the opportunity to do beforehand, except on aircraft. So we're now going from the aircraft where you think of Greg Asner flying a spectrometer and a LiDAR together, Neon flying a spectrometer and a LiDAR together, camera, and we're starting to get that kind of instrumentation, which is, again, to me, just put my cards out here, to me, the combination of the LiDAR and the spectrometer, because you get, spectrometry gets you sort of composition and function of systems, the LiDAR gets you the three-dimensional structure of those systems, incredibly complementary. That's sort of the biodiversity satellite suite. And you can throw a radar in if you want to get, moisture and sort of, anybody can understand radar, black art, but you can throw a radar in and get sort of the moisture water, which is great with you. That would be like the grand slam, of remote sensing for biodiversity. So we're about entering at a time when we say they're going to be available, and they're going to be freely and openly available. So it's on us and our colleagues as a community to try to start figuring out how we're going to pull on this data. Because there's frankly an attitude where I work at NASA, I think that, yeah, biodiversity is important. Not as big a deal as climate, but it's a big deal, yeah, but that community's not really ready to go yet, to use these data. It's sort of a nascent situation. They're not big drawers on the data we've got. They like to map with Landsat. That's really nice, and that's about as sophisticated as they're going to get. So we have to step up over the next few years to demonstrate to these guys that are making decisions about what to launch that, no, we can use spectrometry. We can use LiDARs. We can use radar, et cetera. In terms of commercial stuff, I just flew this out. This is the first of the Planet. Now it's called, it used to be called Planet Lab. I guess now it's Planet. Their flock of doves. This was in 2014. They launched it from the space station. Last year, 2017, they launched. They've got the full flock up there now. Bottom line. So they're doing the global every day. I think it's 4 meter-ish data. Doesn't mean they're all the time everywhere, but they get you. They've got enough of these little. Two satellites right here. Got these little satellites flying around in a constellation to get you that kind of data on a daily basis. Keep cloudy, whatever, but still, that's crazy. That's a lot of data, and they're making some of it free to folks, to you guys. So take advantage of that. This is all just to say that we're living in a time now of incredible data richness. And it's a time also when, as you're training your students, I know, most of you, I think, are training them in genetic, genomic approaches, molecular approaches to your science. That's great. But those are tools. Likewise, these are tools. And so you need to make sure that in their toolkit, they're also able, it doesn't mean they have to become a remote sensing expert or whatever, but they need to at least know people and be able to work with those data and combine with the other data they're doing, ideally that's genetic data, so that they can make so much greater than those individual farms. It's really, really important that you're training the next level, the next group of students to use these data sets like any other tool. Doesn't mean they have to be the best at it, but they should have some exposure to it. If you don't, then the negative bias against this community as a non-remote sensing community will continue, and you'll miss the train. And it's going to go, and they'll do mineral stuff, and they'll do atmospheric stuff, and they'll do, you know, basic plant cover. They'll do biogeochemistry. They will not do biodiversity. It's just one. And money will, everything will follow those. You know, it doesn't help. I'll argue, you know, that a handheld ASD spectrometer costs like $45 or $50 or $60,000, and that nobody wants to cut an undergraduate, much less you know, our graduate student loose with one of those in the field. So that's a big problem. I'll grant you, but there are cheaper spectrometers out there. We've got to get the undergraduates and even high school students exposed to full spectral data, full freaking spectrum, not what a banner use, you know, just the whole thing. And then there's so much power in that. And until we do that, their spectroscopy is always going to be this spooky, oh crap, it's a data here. I can't deal with that, you know. But they've got to be able to work with these data sets. LiDAR is great. It's very direct. You see it. It's what it said. You know what it looked like. Radar, not so much. It's backscattering. It's freaky. It depends on the channel the manager looking at it. But those are tools that the undergrads and grads need to use those as part of their tool. But you can't do biogeography in the 21st century or macroecology in the 21st century without years. That's all. Okay, so what NASA's really focusing on right now, big time, is this behavioral survey result that came out from the National Academy in January. NASA takes decadal surveys very seriously. It's the Academy telling the agency what you should do. It's the ultimate cover. It's like, you know, if otherwise it's just we make it up and we decide what it is. But in this case, when Congress says, well, why are you building that and not this? Or why are you building something at JPL instead of Goddard? Or, you know, California versus Maryland or whatever. You know, all these questions come into play. Just point to the decadal survey and say, well, the National Academy told us it's part of the National Academy. So it's our way of getting, you know, sort of the scientific backstop for what we do, so we don't appear to be randomly spending. These are hundreds of millions of dollar instruments of taxpayers' money, just, you know, some program managers win on. So this is a big deal. Just came out in December. There's a lot of elements. I'm not going to walk through all of it. Just one little piece of it that's really relevant for us, I think, is they call out something called designated observables. These are 5 not missions, let's call it Earth observing systems, because they could be one mission, could be a series of missions, could be, you know, the architecture for these hasn't been decided. It's all very much, which is a good thing, because that means you guys can have a role in helping us all decide it. But 5 areas: aerosols, clouds, convection, precipitation, mass change, surface deformation change. And then the sweet one right here, SVG, power over here, surface biology and geology. This is basically to be a visible shortwave infrared, so 350-ish to 2,500 nanometers visible, you know, so starting out in UV, going to the visible, going to near infrared, going shortwave infrared. Shortwave is really for plants, genes, so it's not a minute. Shortwave actually gives you a lot, because, you know, I think most plants deal with visible light in a common way, but they don't all deal with shortwave. So you get some really conserved traits there that are really interesting for taxonomic phylogenetic discrimination. Anyway, so visible wave, and then also multispectral or hyperspectral thermal on the same system. So you get the thermal, it gives you the temperature data. You all know how important temperature is. So that's a very powerful package. We've been told by management that they think this particular surface biology and geology designated observable will be one of the first ones out of the box, going into what we call formulation or phase A, and then that's likely to start in 2021 or 22. It's actually budget which allows us to start, assuming we don't get crushed budgetarily, which is always possible. But right now, budgets are actually looking okay. So that gives us a couple of years to plan for, and NASA's setting up studies at the NASA centers, but those studies will be open to other agencies, nonprofits, academia, private sector, and international. So there'll be large-scale studies to do each of these designated observables over the next 1 to 2 years. Hopefully, this will be one of the first ones out of the box, which means
mid to late 2020s. I know it's probably dead then. But not, not that far out. We'll have a global, somewhere around 30-meter Landsat-like, 30 meters every other week, 16-day, full spectrometer, multispectral, perhaps even hyperspectral thermal. So huge data volumes, big issues there, but really how the full spectrum regulated that kind of, I mean, it's going to be neat. And Janine has done a lot. This is from an essay she and some folks did in the American Journal of Botany, but done a lot of other work out in the Dimensions grant. This is a really sweet, short essay, just making the point about the power of spectra to understand many traits, characters of plants. And her particular ability to, and her team's ability to relate spectral diversity to phylogeny, which is always out there. Nobody, we didn't dare, back in Diane's day, Diane Wickham's time, we didn't dare utter the words taxonomy or phylogeny in association with satellite data. Because it was like, there's no way you can do that. That's bullshit. Don't oversell it. Don't oversell it. Don't oversell it. You're going to lead the community out of that. But that was always sort of in the back of our minds. Wow, this could actually work. If there was something in how plants work with light, how they, the optics of plants, that actually was conserved in such that you could get back and, understand something about the evolutionary history of that plant. Wouldn't that be freaking amazing? And it turns out we may have some, thanks to this Janine's work and some other work that's coming out now, it looks like there are some conserved plants that feel something about taxonomy technology, which is, that's fantastic. That's what we hoped, but barely dared to utter, and it looks like, there's some really positive glimmers of hope. So a great area for folks to work on in the future. Again, this relates directly back to that designated observable and its importance. And it's rising over the last decade where it's sort of almost an afterthought to something now where, okay, let's do that first out of the box. This kind of work helps build the consensus about the importance of it. Just want to So I'm not saying species has to be everything, but to me, it seems like that's sort of a common language for our community. And even if we're using traits, functional types, what have you, at some point we're going to have to translate those back into species to communicate to some folks. Maybe it's peers in another discipline. Maybe it's just a general public who need to know what we're doing and tend to get species, but may not know what the heck a functional trait is. And so just don't, completely forget taxonomy. Anyway, enough of that. But in terms of networks, do we need physical networking, or do we need a social network? And of course, the answer is yeah, we need both. Because right, Giovanni, I'll just say I've mentioned it. I think it's an existing global framework for organizing biodiversity observations. A lot of people working for free. There are individual issues there. They haven't done it all perfectly, but it's what we got, and we should use that. It's a global framework of observations, satellite in situ, to understand biodiversity. Who else has done it? If they didn't do it, we'd have to do it anyway. So let's go ahead and just try to make it better, useful, work with it. I encourage that to be sort of that last bullet about the programmatic. How do we fit all of this we're doing into a national or global construct? I think Giovanni is one global construct we should work with at the national level and don't turn our backs on it. This is a nice slide that Annie Large-Artery, who's now head of IPDES, put together, the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Services, basically showing how you sort of do the work of understanding biodiversity change. And so the Uber network and her simple Venn diagram framework, where you've got different groups. You've got the assessment process, IPDES, think of like, you can do this for climate. She actually had a climate one, then she did this on that. So think of IPCC for climate, IPDES is forming the national assessment. How's biodiversity doing? Well, let's look at literature and find out. So that's the
assessment. She's actually the executive secretary for that. You've got policy bodies, the conventions that, if it were climate, it'd be the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the SCCC. For biodiversity, we actually have multiple. There's the CED, Convention on Biodiversity, the Ramsar CITES, so there are multiple conventions there. A little complicated, but we do have, that's the policy. These are the guys that say, well, what are we going to do as a government in response to how biodiversity is changing? So you've got information, policy, you've got an observational group, again, GeoBond here. There are other geo groups, there's CEOs for climate, parallel that, and then there's the research where Walt has been involved in Future Earth, a number of you involved in Future Earth, which took over after Diversitas went away. But it's providing sort of the research. So all these research, these assessment, these policy, tells an observation guys what to look at and fun observations. It's also integrated, mixed, working out. Trying to finish up quickly. Requirements, if from a perspective, not just of the satellite agency, but anytime you're trying to build something, NEON has the same issues we do when we're trying to build it. You need requirements. Engineers speak requirements. That's how they view the world. But if you're building something, you sort of want to know what I have to build, what's the minimum I have to do, how to make it simple, redundant, but still get the science done that you guys want to get done. So it's really important to think about how to translate your science into requirements. It's not easy, it's not comfortable. Scientists and engineers are very different types of people. Scientists are out there trying to push boundaries. It's very sort of far viewing. Engineers tend to be very grounded. They want the most efficient, simplest, straightforward path, ideally with redundancy, so that if something screws up, it'll continue to work. And that often means, forcing scientists into a box they don't want to be forced into, so there's a lot of tension there. But when they work together, as places like NASA gets them to do, it's magic. You actually get them in a harness, and the scientists are pulling into the engineers, kicking and screaming. The engineers are pulling back the science, kicking and screaming. It's a big fight, but ultimately they build something that's never been done before, and it's really amazing. So where that all starts, and what we're going to be doing at this meeting coming up, which I meant to mention, sorry, I blew right by it. There's a meeting, there it is, in August 15th to 17th at the Carnegie Institution in DC that hopefully many of you will be there, where we're going to start defining what this is going to be. Very basic. What it is going to do is it's a 3-day meeting. The first day and a half will be looking back at the history concept, which was something the old Decadal survey called 10 years ago, which was also a visible shortwave infrared spectrometer and multispectral thermal. Look back on what we've done in the last decade in terms of building those ideas, and then the second day and a half, we'll look at, okay, where are we going to go forward with this new construct? And so it's going to start with this diagram that I pulled from Ryan Pavlik at JPL. It's a science traceability measure chart. You can do these for applications too. Science applications traceability measure. Where you start over on the left, your left is science questions, terrestrial ecosystems, aquatic ecosystems, very top level, what are the structure, function, biodiversity, now, why are they changing landscapes? Very, very, very top level. Then you come up with some objectives from that. We want to map species in this place, support targeted vegetation species section outside of that. If you're going to do that, then what are the parameters you actually want to measure? What are the scales of the extent of grain size if you do all those measurements, and what are the time temporal frequencies? So we're going to start doing this exercise with this as a kickstart for that new mission in August at the Carnegie Institution. So I encourage that's an open meeting. You Google history, HY, should put that thing here. History, Science, and Applications Workshop. We'll take you there, August 15th to 17th, Carnegie in DC. It's really important for this community, your colleagues, to have a voice in that, because that's going to define how big a piece of that mission or observing system, whatever it becomes, is focused on biodiversity. Let's get started. All right. So that's
about it. So suggestions, consider workflows as one way to organize these 4 different topics and then link them. Focus on the language that biologists and citizens frankly understand. Taxonomy and phylogeny. Doesn't mean you avoid functional traits and types. It just means that you group them in this language so that you can get back to it. Your workflow to explain to the rest of the world what it is you're actually doing in terms of what are you really protecting, what are you really, what's the, wait, you're doing what? What's the functional traits? Then put the workflows together. Requirements are really important if you're actually going to build something, and I think for the point in time, both in terms of this satellite instrument or mission, but also more importantly in terms of what we're trying to set up here. We're trying to build a network, a community, a functioning network to understand biodiversity and how it's changing. How are we going to build that? At least you open us up the manual, right? The code, the do this, fund this, and by the way, NASA will be listening too, and other agencies too. Guys, fund this and we'll have that. So that's what you want to, and so start thinking of it, think in terms of requirements, because building things means some sort of engineering, some sort of requirements. It makes you think cleanly, much more clearly about what it is you're actually trying to do. That's really useful. I think we should be doing NSF, NASA, everybody should be funding regular scaling workshops just on sort of the theory of how life scales. Because there's so much still to be done there. As we heard this bit of you, Craig's just sort of tip and toe, and yes, they do us the UG exam stability, how challenging it is, even with all the data sets we have, and we got a lot. Consider whether we need a global modeling framework. This is something that put a little money on a couple of years back to see whether there was any sense in taking sort of the top-down approach to modeling, whether there was such a thing as a global or large-scale biodiversity model. This was in the wake of the group at in Cambridge did the anyway, the global model, biodiversity model. Whether that was a useful paradigm for us or not, and I know we're not climate modelers, climate's different, and all that, but whether there were lessons to be learned from the climate community for us that would at least help us organize ourselves better at big scales and thinking about biodiversity laws as a global phenomenon. How would you start to look at it globally? Because it's really low, it's manifested, of course, locally, and so sort of flips it all on its head. But just whether there's a global framework, modeling framework that would really be helpful. Maybe not, I don't know. And still, there's some interesting, and people like Simon Ferrier and others have been working on this. It's just interesting glimpses of what you might do. Keep in touch with Giovanni, force it to help you and to become better than it is. Engage with this Decadal survey exercise, August being the next step, but there'll be other efforts as well. There'll be, I'm sure, calls for folks to start putting together a science team. So that designated observable, that's another way to engage with things, and then just time is short. Because we really are at the sort of the last days of, we're gonna, I know it seems like a long time when you build a mission, it's like 5, 6, 7 years, and it's just, oh, that's forever. Well, it goes incredibly quickly when you're trying to do the underpinning science. And it tends to be sort of retro in that the science, the science doesn't necessarily grow all the way to when the mission's launched. Usually it's sort of locked in place several years before launch. So you're sort of like, you have to sort of go with what you got at a certain point. And it's critical to be as far along the road as we can be. So that's my, thanks.